your presence today. I want to thank the participants, the panelists, our moderator of the day, who is Samuel Laval, and who really did a lot of work on the topic we are going to tackle today. I want to thank our interpreter, Una, who is translating live from English to French. Thank you for all the speakers not to speak too quickly if possible. And a few technical reminders for the interpretation of the French people. Click on the bottom of your screen. There's a little globe, as you can see, and you can choose the language you like to listen. So if you want to ask your questions in the chat, please do so, and we will try to answer to them at the end of the session. I would like to say that this session is being recorded and will be made available in replay on our site and on our YouTube channel.
You can click on the globe to choose the language you prefer, English or French. All the session is translated. Rapidement, sans prendre trop de temps.
And by no further ado, I would like to present the Climate Chess Association. It is an international platform which gathers non-state actors to support climate action. We work with local collectivities, NGOs, researchers, associations, women association, environmental association, etc. We are here to support the action of these actors for the climate by working on three different pillars. Information, first, access to information. There's an internet website where we publish everything in French and English, and all our activities that are led, and they are in both languages. The other pillar is that of mobilization of the actors, these non-state actors for climate. There are summits organized, events in face-to-face, but also digital events, virtual events, as we for a little time now. And there have been good results, and we are mobilizing our community around these activities in the framework of thematic coalitions on different sectors. And finally, our last pillar, and this is why we are together today, it's for the climate analysis or action for climates. And our observatory is making an analysis of those actions every year. This is why today the Climate Change Observatory is publishing its 2020 edition of its World Report on Climate Action by Sector. It is the third edition now, and this report for 2020 is 250 pages translated into English and French, giving an overview of the climate actions implemented on the 6 continents in different emission sectors. It is based on more than 500 sources, and it offers, therefore, a quantitative and qualitative reading of the evolution of global greenhouse gas emissions. And today, this roundtable is to go into more details on one sector, that of the textile industry. And this debate will help us look at the topic further into detail by relying on the report we are publishing this week. So we are continuing to pursue our work on the problematic of the week, which is has the COVID stopped things or accelerated things in terms of climate actions. So for our report on the sector, I'm going to give the floor to Samuel now. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Romain. Thanks to all the participants, all the panelists for taking part in this discussion. For 10 minutes, I'm going to present you with the trends in climate action in the textile industry. And this part of the industry, there will be 2 focuses, one on the textile and one on steel as well. But today we decided to have this workshop for the textile industry, and it's Black Friday in France and around the world, I believe, perhaps. So we have called this section Trends in Climate Action in the Textile Industry, so fashion and COVID-19, fast fashion and accelerating its cycle. To talk about the sectoral global emissions first, we soon noticed by preparing and starting to work on the report that there were a lot of different assessments of the global carbon report or assessment, and sometimes with the textile for home or industrial textile. Sometimes it's just about clothes, but there's also, does that include shoes? There are other perimeters that often change. Different sources and a lot of different figures can be found. And what we have decided to highlight are information coming from a global fashion agenda published in August, and they estimate that for the life cycle of our shoes and clothes, 2 gigatons of CO2 emissions. So that is a very high, significant contribution to global warming and climate change. And what we can see on this graph on the right side is a production phase that are most responsible for the gas emissions, with namely part of to produce raw materials and to produce synthetic fibers made from plastic, made thanks to the petrochemical industry and through the transformation of petrol, oil. So what do the actors do? This is what we try to answer to in this report. And so what are the actors doing to try to reduce the impact, to mitigate this impact in this sector? So first, the producers. We have classified 5 types of actions led by the companies on the choice of the raw materials with less impact, for example, hemp, linen, organic cotton. And this category, 2/3 cotton, has gathered all the initiatives to improve the production of cotton, and it is improving. They're making progress. As for organic cotton, the share has doubled in a year, but we need to know that it's only 1% of cotton produced. Another way to reduce the impact is to act on the processes to dye the textile, for example, different dyeing stages. There's another study that was published a few years ago, by Qantas, and they saw this treatment phase and dyeing stages as the ones that emit the most, 36% of the global emissions, and other reports by Acroma. Of course, there are other emissions due to transportation all around the planet. And of course, they have to travel many kilometers, millions of kilometers sometimes to reach our shops or in our homes. And here again, according to a survey made after the lockdown, it was possible to show that producers and brands try to refocus their ways to produce geographically after the several waves of lockdown. Of course, the sector was hit very hard. There are actions to act on the sustainability of clothes. Since the year 2000s, the production has more than doubled, and the use of clothes has diminished. So people are trying to adopt more sober ways of using their clothes. They have access to repairing clothes sometimes. And there's people help, there are groups that go around the world to help people repair their clothes to give them a second life. And brands are setting up rental for clothes as well. And there's also circular economy, of course. We say today that there's less than 1% of garments that are thrown away and recycled to create new garments, while about 12% are downcycled, which means they become rags, for example, or less good quality products. And there's a new production emerging here for recycled materials. And this is an example of a compostable pant. It's a Swiss brand called Freitag that you see on the screen. And for this circularity, we see that there are studies that show the benefits of this circular production and how some impacts are mitigated. And this is compared to conventional production means. In general, they're trying to be less energy consuming. So this shows the necessity to operate a great change in the way that we produce clothes and the way we consume clothes as well. And we can wonder if all these actions, are they just adjustments on the side, on the margin, or on the opposite, are these first steps toward better production? So what we have observed in the last years for climate actions from the consumers, there's an American platform that said things could become more important than with fast fashion, and the public sector can encourage these trends. For example, by the implementation of new extended producer responsibility. There's one in France that was launched about 10 years ago, and it will be extended to most of the European Union with a special Green Deal. And there were tax cuts to encourage these moves. So these are the trends that we have noticed in the last year. And of course, this year with the COVID-19, in fact, during the first lockdown during the spring, there were a lot of different declarations from fashion actors, textile actors to rethink the system. For example, I put a quote from two organizers of the New York and London Fashion Week on May 19th, 2020. And we see this will that is supported by the preoccupations coming from the consumers and the result of a poll which expresses the desire of consumers to change their consumption, their habits. And we can wonder to what extent COVID has accelerated or hampered climate strategies in the textile industry. To talk about this, we have invited and we have the pleasure to welcome three speakers: Carrie Summers, founder and global operations director for Fashion Revolution. Hello, Carrie. Thomas Hurier, who is the founder and CEO of the brand 1083. And finally, Mirela Orlovic, who is a professor at Sciences Po in sustainable luxury and marketing and founder of Urban Meisters. Thank you very much, all of you, to be with us today. I will begin. I'm going to remove my PowerPoint now, and I will start by a question to you, Carrie. There are environmental and climatic preoccupations, but social preoccupations as well in the textile industry. And social policies. There was a infamous incident in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh where more than 1,100 people lost their lives in the collapse of a building housing textiles. And this was a trigger for you that prompted you to found Fashion Revolution. So my question is, to what extent at that time was that part of Fashion Revolution? And how are these preoccupations present in society and also in the creation of Fashion Revolution? Did from the start you had in mind those social fights, or did it take more time? Hello, Samuel. I'm going to switch to English.
Fashion Revolution was, as you said, set up after the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh. And it was really clear to me at that time that the fashion industry needed revolutionary change. And that's when Fashion Revolution was born. And 7 years on, we've become the world's largest fashion activism movement. So we're mobilizing citizens, industry, and policymakers through research, education, and advocacy work. And as you said, this came out of a human tragedy. And at the beginning, our focus was very much on the human impact of the fashion industry, but we very soon brought the environmental and climate issues into our remit, and the human exploitation and the ecosystem degradation that we see all around us in the fashion industry today, really the product of centuries of colonialism and globalized exploitation. And I believe they stem very much from a sort of a Western focused worldview in which the human and environmental prosperity are often seen as being isolated and disconnected from each other. And they stem very much from a fashion industry which reinforces inequality, and it devalues the voices of a lot of minority groups, people of colour, women, and non-Western perspectives. So, we believe at Fashion Revolution we just cannot continue to degrade our land, pollute our oceans, and fall far short of those climate change targets. And we can't allow big business to continue to profit whilst the supply chain workers are struggling to live in dignity. So we're a part of this wider living world, and our right to a healthy environment depends on the health of the planet. And this was really brought home to me earlier this year when I sailed 2,000 miles in the Pacific. I sailed to Easter Island, which is the remotest inhabited island in the world. And I carried out scientific research along the way into the chemicals and the microplastics in our oceans. And the results were really shocking, so far from any land mass. And textiles are both the primary and secondary source of ocean microplastics. And the chemicals in and on these plastics are also entering our bodies every time we have a glass of water, a glass of beer, every time we eat seafood. And these are endocrine disruptors. They're affecting our health and our fertility. So we really need to look, I think, in a more holistic way at how human health, human rights, and the rights of nature are interconnected. And actually, this is very timely because next year, Fashion Revolution's theme will be rights, relationships, and revolution. So we will be looking at how human rights and the rights of nature are interconnected and interdependent, and how we need to shift our relationship with each other, our relationship with our clothes, and our relationship with fashion supply chains and the natural world for our own prosperity and for the well-being of our earth.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me?
T'entends.
Ouais.
Yes, we can hear you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Thomas Hurier,
So Thomas Hurier is here with us today from 1083 company. You are also trying to have this holistic approach, looking at environmental and social issues. And I've known you since the launch of 10,083 because I know Porspoder very well in Brittany, where I have family ties, and it is one of the extreme points, along with the town of Menton, of the 1,083 kilometers that separate the two furthest towns in France. Because if I remember correctly, because your project right from the start with 10,083, or at least as I have known it, is to set up a production cycle only in France. So you were quite naturally cited in this section of our report on the textile industry and relocation among the 5 types of actions that we noted. But in fact, you're active on many other levels. And my question to you would be, where do you find that there is a ratio to facilitate or impact the environment? Where is it most interesting? What is the priority? What would you recommend to a clothing brand to set up tomorrow and to reduce its impact on the environment and the climate? Hello, everyone. I would say that there's no universal journey or path to take. Everybody today is going to the same place with more sustainability on the economic level. Today, the world as it is not necessarily sustainable because we are going to run out of certain resources, and our aim is to become sustainable. But in fact, it all depends on the starting point, and that's what the journey depends on. We all have the same point of arrival. We started working in 2013, and yes, we named our association 1083. It's the number of kilometers, not of France. It's not inside France, in fact, those kilometers, but it goes to, yes, Menton, to another city to the southwest of France. But behind this notion of kilometers, what it hides is the notion of proximity, because we all see that our world is not very reasonable. We're intelligent, but not reasonable. And therefore, it's full of excesses, things that don't work very well. And this is why I wanted to think about what could make us be more reasonable, and what leads us to reason. Those levers are not very exciting, not very interesting. For those who take their car, use their cars, they see, okay, you cannot travel very fast with your car. And we know because it pollutes, so we know that, but we still do not constantly respect the rules because we're not robots, we're human beings. And because of that, and for as long as possible, I hope we will remain so, to reach rational answers, we need some part of a rational to find an opening. And I believe that the most powerful lever to bring people to be more open is proximity. And this is, yes, what happened in Rana Plaza. And if it crumbled down next to Romont or in Paris or London or New York, for example, there would be monuments to celebrate the memory of these 2,000 workers who died there. It's Bangladesh. This is where it happened. And of course, we were touched for one day, perhaps not to say an hour when we read the news, but we were be touched even more so if it was close to us, if some family had been part of that accident. And to use that emotion when it's a drama, it can be used negatively, but positively as well when it's about consuming and consumption. Maybe some of you like wine, and if you buy the same bottle of wine at the supermarket, for example, it'll be at a certain price, and the same bottle of wine that you'll buy from the producer and after having heard him explain about his work, that's totally magical. And this bottle will be less expensive, better than in the supermarket. So I truly believe in proximity. 1083 is a proximity brand. And this means that the more we grow, the more able we will rationalize production for our customers. And the more we grow, the more we will be able to export not only jeans, but what we make locally to perhaps send jeans to Bangladesh. But sending jeans from France to Bangladesh is as stupid as sending friends from Bangladesh to France. So it's this multi-local society on which we want to work on, and we're working on it since September with one great mission, which is to bring everyone to produce and consume in a circular economy and invest in this circular economy with 3 projects. The first, we have one, it's called Voluntary for Firemen. And from these old firemen's clothes that are recycled, we have a project for Infinite. These are jeans that are made in polyester, recycled polyester, only one unique material. And it's a totally circular loop because, of course, these jeans are recycled. It's not innovative. We've been doing that for 30 years already, namely for some types of jackets, but it's one material, monomaterial, and even the buttons, everything is monomaterial. And so that at the end of life of these clothes, they will be easily recycled, which means that they can be recycled if they are collected at the end of their life cycle. So these jeans will be sold 100 euros per with a deposit. So when you bring them back, the people get their money deposit back. And the third project for circular economy that we are setting up is for cotton. We will produce our raw material, cotton, in France, not by planting cotton fields because we don't have the right climate to do so, but to avoid planting cotton in France, we will invest in cotton fields abroad. And so these are the 3 main projects for circular economy. And on the for the human aspects, we have values to be. We are ambitious, we have ideas, transparency, what we want for everyone around us, our clients, our colleagues, and enthusiasm, because we spent at least 7 hours of our day at work. And if we are bored at work, there's no interest in that. So this is what 1083 is. There's a lot of work, a lot of obstacles, difficulties, a lot of boring things, of course. It's real life, but with this framework, we are very motivated. Thank you very much. You gave us a wonderful overview of the actions that are possible by Marc to reduce impacts. And there's another category, which are commitments on carbon trajectories, being carbon neutral, net zero carbon, etc. And we talked about it separately in the report because we wanted to focus on what was done, not the commitments. So a few years ago, in the big brands like Walmart in the States, we have seen that carbon neutrality, the objective is to reach carbon neutrality before 2040, but Mirela Olovic, you talked about these commitments, and you talked about, you created No Greenwashing, the collective. Could you tell us more about it? And then could you talk about these commitments?
First, I would like to set the context a little bit. When I founded Urban Masters in 2015, during the COP21 in Paris, awareness was still very low for climate change, for biodiversity loss, etc. The objective of Urban Masters at the beginning was to create a space for consumers to exchange on existing solutions and help them start a sustainable, more healthy lifestyle. It has developed in the past 5 years to a network which is consisting of consumers, startups, and groups that we accompany during the transition to a more sustainable consumption and way of production. And we have seen that what happened in the last 5 years is overall very exciting because there's enormous dynamics. Startups are popping up all over the space. Big groups are getting into pressure and want to react and are reacting. And everybody is kind of starting to talk about good things, the more sustainable, the more ethic actions. And unfortunately, what I have been seeing, me and the other experts with whom we have co-founded the No Greenwashing Collective, is that it's not easy. There are a lot of terminology that is used to talk about more sustainable actions, but they just show one part of the overall picture. And Carrie said a little bit in her introduction about how holistic, how interdependent our ecosystem is. So claims like carbon neutral, or even more recently, more and more used carbon negative, are super dangerous. To explain this, let me just first go back. What is greenwashing? What does this mean? Greenwashing means that a brand explains a product to be more sustainable or more ethic than it really is. This can be done intentionally or unintentionally. What is important is that the consumer understands the product in a certain way, the product or the brand, by the way. And so when you say carbon neutral, a normal consumer out there will say, super, there's no problem anymore because the product that I've consumed or the brand that from whom I'm purchasing, they're not producing any carbon, but which is not true, because what means carbon neutral is that the brands that are claiming carbon neutral, well, first of all, they need to measure carbon neutral. You say in your report, it's super complicated. The supply chain and fashion is extremely extremely dispatched all around the world. So in order to measure your carbon footprint, that's already a big challenge. Let's say you do it in a super accurate way. You work with big partners. Qantas, for example, is one of them. You mentioned them several times in your report. Let's say you measure your carbon footprint the right way. How are you going to be carbon neutral? Well, the brands that use this claim, they do it in 2 ways. On the one hand, and hopefully they reduce their carbon emissions. This is the way forward, that this is what they have to do, but they can totally erase them, because when you produce something, you create carbon. So they do carbon offsetting. I'm not going to go into detail. This is another big and complex field, but carbon offsetting means that you use the carbon and somebody else or something else invests in carbon reducing technology. So there are a lot of different possibilities. This could be forestation, for example, or others. What is difficult here is also to choose the right activity, where you can say, okay, here, these are really qualitative ones, and these are really valuable for our ecosystem. So let's say that you do even this in the right way. Still, carbon neutral is a dangerous claim because it does not tell you about how much water was used, how much water was polluted, how much danger was done to the biodiversity, and also Carrie mentioned it again, what impact for health does the product that you are consuming mean? So now you can tell to myself, okay, fashion, what's the impact on health? Well, there's the big one, microplastics. As we said, 1/3 of overall microplastics going in the ocean come from the fashion industry. But I also want to alert on the new types of materials that are popping up, like recycled plastic. Honestly, we have so less really good information about what plastic does to our human body and how it influences our health and our overall hormonal system. Wearing recycled plastic on my skin when I use it, and it's frictions with my skin, and maybe recycled plastic penetrates into my body, I don't know. I think also there we should be cautious. So you see, to conclude, I understand claims like carbon neutral are used to be able to measure the improvements done, and I think it's important that we have objectives, that we measure our progress. But we should be very careful how we use them and to whom we expose them. Because if you're just a normal consumer, this could lead you to taking the wrong decisions when you're purchasing. You could be super. I've purchased a product which is carbon neutral, and I don't have to do anything else anymore. Whilst you say it very correctly in your report, 23% of the carbon footprint is done during the usage or the after use of a fashion item. So super important to reduce climate change and our efforts on super reductive claims like that.
Thank you. Et justement, une manière.
Yes, and Carrie Summers, a way to talk about greenwashing and look at the commitments of brands is to have clear access to information. And you said you published recently
Fashion Revolution.
Fashion Revolution, the 2020 edition of Fashion Transparency Index. Could you tell us what you retain from that? What do brands give sufficient access to their data, and do they know their own impact?
Yes, I mean, as you say, in April, we published the 5th edition of our Fashion Transparency Index. And in this edition, we covered 250 of the world's biggest brands and retailers. And we designed the index for a number of reasons. We wanted to compare the levels of transparency amongst the world's biggest fashion brands. We also wanted to push them, to incentivize them to disclose more credible, comparative and detailed information. We wanted to leverage their competitive tendencies. And we also wanted to analyze the trends in transparency across the industry. And transparent disclosure makes it easier for everyone. It makes it easier for all of the relevant parties to understand when something's gone wrong, who is responsible and how to fix it. So we believe that transparency leads to greater accountability, which will eventually lead to a change in the way in which the industry works. I mean, some brands can be publishing a lot of information and actually not be making much of an impact, particularly if they're producing large quantities. And other brands might be doing really good things behind the scenes, but if they're not disclosing that information, we don't know about it. So I think it's really important not to confuse transparency with sustainability. And as Mirella said, transparency isn't just for transparency's sake. The information which is disclosed by the companies needs to be detailed enough to take action upon. So in our index, we look at 5 areas. We look at the brand's social and environmental policies, practices and impacts. We look at their governance. We look at traceability, we look at assessment and remediation, so often typically through audits, and we look at spotlight issues, which change to some extent every year. Now, in the good news this year, for the first time, we saw a few brands scoring above 70%. But the overall average score amongst the 250 brands is 23%. Now that's up from 21% amongst the 200 brands which were covered in the 2019 index. But when you look at the overall picture, more than half of the brands are scoring 20% or less. And a handful of brands, and that's not just the cheap fashion brands, and some of it, or quite a few of them, are the luxury brands, are disclosing nothing at all. And I find some of the results really shocking. I mean, we've been talking about plastic pollution, and I saw at first hand this year the urgency of the plastic pollution issue. And I would expect to see real action from the industry. But just 20% of brands are explaining what they're doing to reduce the shedding of microfibers from their clothing. And only around a third of brands are publishing any measurable progress towards reducing the use of virgin plastics. And I guess when we're looking at COVID-19, I mean, it's sort of shone a spotlight on overconsumption, overproduction, and we've seen or heard about all of the clothing which is piling up in the warehouses. And what will happen to all of this when only around a quarter of brands are publishing information about the steps they're taking to reduce the amount of pre-consumer textile waste? And only 18% of brands are explaining what they're doing to develop circular solutions that enable textile to textile recycling. So we really urgently need to see more action and more disclosure from the industry.
Merci beaucoup. Et un chiffre aussi que
Thank you
j'avais
very much. And a figure that I had seen in this Fashion Transparency Index is that 16% of the brands publish their CO2 emissions. So we are far from the expected levels. You mentioned, Carrie Summers, that during the COVID, you mentioned the effect on the fashion sector and textile industry. And I would like to start by you, Thomas Hurier, because we saw in the presentation the teachings, the lessons learned from these analysis and the positions that were taken during the first lockdown. I would like to have your ideas on the production side. What have there things that you have noticed in the last months, changes? And then I will ask Carrie Summers for consumers, and then Mirela for students. So I'm going to talk about greenwashing. It's very frustrating, and it's not dignified to do this. It's really lame. But what I did is I started to work in politics a few years ago in Romans-sur-Isère, 30,000 people living in this town. And my idea was very marginal at the time. I wanted to work, I had a Peruvian clothes, but nothing is as bad as being marginal, because seeing all these brands talking about their virtue, and somehow this accelerates the awareness of consumers. So I'm going to go back to greenwashing. By greenwashing, do not brands accelerate the consciousness of the consumers, but isn't it more and more difficult to tell lies on social networks? Namely, it's very annoying, it's frustrating, it's bad, but it's even worse when we're very marginal, not known. And it's a bit like Black Friday. We say how bad it is every year, and you see sometimes it's really too much, and people criticize it, and this leads to consumers to think about it more deeply. And so this is what I wanted to say. Concerning COVID, as in any crisis, the COVID crisis was an accelerator, meaning that the brands which worked with organizations or processes, network subsidiaries, and which were not healthy, in fact, were going straight into the wall. And those who were building themselves in a more healthy way and growing in a healthy way were on the right tracks. And this crisis accelerated everything, which means that brands that didn't have very good positioning and hadn't done much actions to tell their consumers what they were doing, these are really hitting a hard rock, so to speak, and they're not doing well. But those working with consumers are doing better. For all these brands who are on the right tracks, they have a whole arrival of new customers who said, okay, I don't want to buy things that are cheap but not good quality. If you look at the composition on a jean, you can see that in fact, even the expensive, not expensive, they're made in the same place. consumers are starting to understand this and understanding that with their credit card, they have the possibility to help local productions. And it is even more important because before it was difficult to provide consumers with this that I'm showing here, a mask made of textile. It was impossible to protect citizens at some not so remote time. So now a consumer can say, with my credit card, I can be part of this new type of production. And this is what the crisis has accelerated. There's an industrial activity, a commercial activity, and the commercial activity for 1083 has accelerated the growth, but the industrial activity, those making jeans for 1083, has decreased because of the COVID crisis. So there's a sort of mutation from one model to the other. And in any crisis, there have been opportunities for change. And we want to create the most sustainable economy thanks to these elements in the crisis. It's very violent, it's difficult, it's sudden for everyone, but we must become aware that we need to optimize, to work, and to become stronger than we used to be. Thank you very much. What about consumers, Carrie Somers? You recently, with Fashion Revolution, had a fashion survey, and it was during the summer, after the first lockdown measures. Have you seen in the results of the polls a COVID effect on the habits or the desires to consume?
Yes, well, we conducted our first ever consumer survey 2 years ago amongst 5,000 people in the 5 largest European markets for clothing, so Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and the UK. And then in August this year, we carried out a follow-up survey with the same number of respondents in the same countries, some of the same questions, some slightly different questions. It's being analysed at the moment, and the report should be out later this month. So I can't necessarily tell you about the comparisons, but there were some really interesting results. So 62% of people say they wear their clothes for at least a few years. But this seems to really vary across countries. So interestingly, 71% of British people wear their clothing for at least a few years, compared to just 39% of Italians. 48% of people overall said they wear their clothes until they fall apart, which I was very pleased to see. 53% of people pass on their unwanted clothes to others for reuse, which seems quite low, and that's 62% of women compared to 44% of men. So we obviously need to encourage the male population to donate more of their clothing to charity shops and to pass it on. And I was really surprised to find that only 14% of people had tried to purchase second-hand clothing in the last 12 months. We hear so much about the rise of the second-hand and the resale market, and that seemed really, really low to me. But what was more encouraging is that 31% of people in the last year have tried to purchase clothing which is designed for durability. And only 9% of people haven't bought any clothing at all in the last 12 months. When we look at washing, Mirella was talking earlier on about the impact of the consumer use phase. And we know that washing at 30 degrees can dramatically reduce the carbon footprint of our clothes. And only around 40% of the respondents do this. And interestingly, this figure really varies across the generations, with only 25% of the people aged 16 to 24 washing at 30 degrees, compared to almost half of the people aged 55 to 75. So again, we need more education of the younger generation, which I found surprising. And we've been talking a lot today about the chemicals in our clothing. And I was really shocked that only 37% of respondents said it's important that the clothing they buy is produced without using harmful chemicals for the consumer. And I think this really reflects the lack of awareness of what these chemicals do to our bodies, to our children's bodies, and the fact that they remain in our bodies, and that body burden gets passed on through the generations as well. So the consumer survey will be out hopefully later on this month, and it will be on the Fashion Revolution website.
Ok, merci. Et donc de vos deux
Thank you
réponses,
very much. So from your two answers, Carrie and Thomas, I think that the COVID, or the crisis COVID, has accelerated trends that were already ongoing, but we are still far from what would be necessary to have a sustainable trajectory. So, Mirella, what about the fashion sector and luxury sector? You are teaching at Sciences Po, sustainable luxury and marketing. So have you seen a change in the desires of your students during the COVID crisis?
Just a little, I have to react to Thomas, who I really invite and encourage to join maybe one hour sessions of the greenwashing committee. I understand what you want is awareness, and Carrie just said it. Their consumers are still not sufficiently informed about sustainability, about climate change, about biodiversity, plastics, etc. But it's not greenwashing what we need, because greenwashing is saying false things, making things appear good, healthy, sustainable. What we need is clearly a sustainable upskilling and education. And this is why my job at Sciences Po is one of the things that makes me very happy, because I know in some way I help to shape our future leaders, hopefully, to be more sustainable. And what I have to tell you is that they're extremely inspired, and COVID made it, of course, even more evident. They're extremely inspired by sustainability. They, for example, are very enthusiastic about everything what is digital for goods or tech for goods. We looked at blockchain, for example, how this can help to increase sustainability. We also looked about on new materials. One example that I can mention with whom we worked was Orange Fiber, who was a new material in textiles that do tissue out of byproducts of the orange juice industry. So everything with tech for good really inspires them. The life cycle approach also, they were super interested in this. How can you already anticipate today how your product, once it is not interesting for your first consumer, can maybe be reused by somebody else or integrated again in the life cycle. So what makes me very confident about the future is that they don't see sustainability as a burden, but they take it as a source of, as a challenge to be even more creative and more smart. And during the last class, we accompanied a startup, which is called Circular Sportswear. They do sportswear out of recycled plastic. And the startup was super thankful because they really came up with a lot of interesting ideas that the startup will take over and has already started taking over. So this is really a positive sign that they are open and that this makes them be even smarter than they were before. So I would end on a positive note, even though the way is very, very long, and we all have to go together.
Thank you. Je crois qu'il y a des questions.
Thank you very much. I think we have some questions from the audience to close this roundtable. And first, a question by Gabrielle Fuston, who is asking, where are we at compared to recycling? With the figures that I provided at the beginning of the presentation, 13% of disposed clothing are recycled, but only 1% is recycled and changed into new clothes. And the rest are used for less quality products. Another question by Alana.
clothes for the next few generations, how do we balance people's need and desire to create with the scaling down of production of new items? Est-ce qu'il y en a un de vous trois qui veut
Would
prendre
one of you answer to one of the questions?
Yeah.
So, Carrie?
I think that's a really interesting question, because it is, how do we balance the needs of the garment workers? How do we balance those social needs with the environmental needs? Because when we talk to the garment workers, and we've done numerous surveys and participated in the biggest ever survey of 540 garment workers who we interviewed every week over the course of a year with microfinance opportunities. And they're saying, we want you to buy, our jobs depend on this. And we know that working in the garment industry can be a real route to independence, to financial security for young women, for their families. But having a job shouldn't preclude having a good job, with dignity, a job with respect, a job with living wages. I mean, some of the statistics in the Fashion Transparency Index are really shocking in terms of how much brands are doing to achieve living wages. So, for instance, only 2% of brands are publishing any kind of a time-bound, measurable roadmap or strategy for how they will achieve living wages across all of their supply chain workers. So it's really difficult, but I think what we have to see is that reprioritization, because I think everybody knows now that the shareholders are getting rich, the CEOs are getting rich. We've seen so many brands and retailers getting bailed out by the government, certainly here in the UK, whilst at the same time the producers are suffering because they're cancelling orders and the workers haven't been paid for orders produced in April and May. And these are people who, from one month to another, in a normal month, have to borrow money so they can get by to the next payday, and they really can't afford to survive a week, let alone a month, without getting paid. So we have to see a rebalancing of the industry, and we have to see living wages across the supply chain, and we have to see clothing being made which is more durable, with better materials which will last longer. But it's difficult. It's going to be very difficult to balance and to marry the two.
Yeah, I agree with Carrie. It's super difficult because fashion lives from the perpetual renewal. And is even fueled by digitalization, by Instagram, and the algorithm lives of news. The most easy thing to give news is to launch a new product. So we will really need a total reset of the way this industry is working along the supply chain. Consumers, including, and all those that are not listening today to this debate but are buying things on Black Friday, are not helping us, because they are constantly fueling this overconsumption, which is at the end at the root of the problem. So we have to start there, at the overconsumption that we are fueling, that is fueling this.
Merci.
Moi, je voulais réagir aussi deux choses.
I wanted to react also. When you look at Romand, we have a lot of shoes stocked. When you look at it, it's like a museum. And when you look at the shoes, the first shoes that were made, we think that you wear clothes not to be naked and to not to be cold. But when you see the first shoes for the women, they are full of jewelry. I'm sorry if it's a caricature, but for men, I'm sorry if I'm making a caricature again, if I'm exaggerated, they're simple. So fashion needs respond to a primary need to make ourselves more beautiful. And we already at the beginning used to wear jewelry or ornaments which is not necessary, in fact. And fashion is identitary. Once you understand that, you understand that the answer cannot be a reasonable one, because we are not answering to an identitary need. Then these people cannot be more reasonable. What is done is to provide an identity response that is stronger coming from an alternative than what already exists. So in my opinion, what is more impacting is pleasure, which means that we need to attract customers with a slow, intense pleasure that will replace a succession of smaller pleasures where you buy trinkets or little things here and there, a sort of crazy consumption, never ending, with micro objects or micro articles. And it is, we need to create these stories, exciting products to make sure that our consumers stop this little drug, which is made by these compulsive purchases. So what I talked in the beginning is that, in my opinion, a great lever to give meaning to the, as in the example of the bottle of wine, you need a story. So the storytelling is important. And this is why we launched 15 days ago a book to make your own jeans at home. If you pick up the challenge to make your own jean, it will not be profitable, and it will probably not be perfect either, but you will be so happy that you made it and you will like to wear it, to show it, and you'll keep it for many years, perhaps longer than a jean you'll have bought 20 euros, which has no meaning for you, no story. So what's important is to touch people and change the consumption to replace this empty type of consumption. So I think we have reached the end of our workshop. Just to close, perhaps, in a few words. So what you will bear in mind from this climate change report and climate change report and these discussions, I don't know who wants to begin. Sorry, I was reading the questions. Can you repeat the question? In a few words to close, what will you bear in mind, what will you keep of the report or these discussions that we had today?
For me, the conclusion is it shows once again how the holistic approach that we need in order to find the right solutions. The exchange of views as we had today with Romain and Carrie, who each one is bringing his different vision to the cake, let's say. That it's going to be tough because coronavirus did accelerate maybe the awareness, but it has been a tough year as far as the results of the industry are concerned. There are distributors, brands dying. We have to see how fast we can, go back and secure for those people who have potentially lost their jobs to integrate, because sustainability is also about giving a secure and respectful work to live and work. And finally, some positivism, because you have shown yourself a lot of interesting dynamism and examples of big groups and startups. What we need is to accelerate. That's for me the big learning. We have to go much faster, much more radical.
Merci. Carrie, vous voulez?
I mean, I would say use your voice and your power as a consumer to bring about change. We know that brands listen to their customers. We have a motto, be curious, find out, and do something about it. So ask the questions. We have some hashtags, who made my clothes and what's in my clothes. So ask the brands, ask them what chemicals they're using, ask them to tell you where your clothes came from and who made them. Start to probe, start to ask those questions and let us know what you find out.
Merci beaucoup. Thomas, vous voulez avoir le mot de la fin?
Thomas, perhaps? Would you like to say a word, Thomas?
Merci, bye.
Yes, Thomas. I wanted to ask you if you want to say the last word. No, I don't deserve it. But what I'd like to say is that this momentum is very strong. What I will keep in mind from these exchanges, I want to thank the translator, the interpreter, who's a woman. And there was a great collective dynamics, and we were very marginal in the beginning. There were ethnical brands, and these were not very seducing, attractive. Now it's more mainstream, but we continue and we try to broaden the offer, and therefore these consumers will come more and more, hopefully. So thank you very much. I think we are going to close this discussion, and we will also bring an end to a wonderful week of great exchanges, 7 debates since Tuesday. And perhaps the teams have turned on their camera. I think everybody has the camera on, all the team members. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you for the teams. And we cannot take a family picture here, but it'll be a screenshot of this year. Thank you very much for participating. We will remember that Antoine needs to have another internet provider because it doesn't work. Do not hesitate to look at our report on climatechance.org. Thank you, everyone. The last debate was extremely interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, and bye-bye.
See you soon.